Welcome back, everybody. After lunch here, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce a wonderful young lady whom I have been blessed to have worked with and got to know, and I feel like I could be her mother, but I know she has a beautiful mother, Celia, but I feel like that. Yes, I feel like that. Cait works hard as a research advocate. She does her research. She's a wealth of knowledge. She volunteers like crazy, and she's so reliable. Anything that I need her to do, she's always willing to do with a smile on her face. So it is my honor to introduce her, Cait Telaak.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hi. So I spoke last year, and for those who are here, you might remember I did a goofy thing at the start of my speech, right? I said hi to my mom and dad. Well, my mom is here with me today, but my dad and my husband are back home, so here we go again. Hi, Dad. Hi, Mike. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover. So today I'm going to cover clinical trials and go into as much detail as I can in a pretty short amount of time, which is why it's aptly named a boot camp. For those of you who are seasoned veterans, I think some of this is going to be fairly familiar, but there is going to be probably some new content for you. And for those who are brand new to clinical trials, this could be a little bit overwhelming. You're going to hear a lot of new terminology, and there should be little packets of paper being passed around, kind of one per family or group. And the second, third, and fourth pages contain a glossary of terms, so that will hopefully give you a little bit of guidance as the presentation commences. But also at the very end, we're going to call up a panel. We're going to have some very smart people come up, and they're going to address any questions that you may have following the presentation. So as for our agenda and what we'll be covering, we're going to talk very briefly about drug development. We're going to talk about clinical trial phasing and also the design with some of that fancy terminology. We're going to talk a little bit about some common misconceptions with clinical trials. I'm also going to go over how to find clinical trials and eligibility, and then beyond that, what it looks like when you're first starting out on a clinical trial. As a part of that, we're going to talk about this behemoth document called Informed Consent. We're going to talk a small amount about how to finance clinical trials, as that's a pretty significant barrier to participation. We'll talk about alternatives if you're not eligible for clinical trials, and then we'll bring up our panel. In between there, because apparently today is survey day, we do have another survey, and I just want to throw out there that these surveys give us so much really great, meaningful information, and also our feedback to some of our partners that have helped fund things like the Corey Foundation, who funded the patient scholarship. So they're really, really valuable, and I know they can get tedious, but we appreciate your feedback. So a little bit about me. So I'm a patient. I was diagnosed November of 2015. And last year I was on chemo, and we found out August 20th in a scan that my disease had progressed on chemo. I had had a lot of conversations with my oncologist at that point about what to do when, because I believed it was going to be a when, my disease progressed on chemo. So we had plans A, B, and C already in the hopper. Plan A, I was very quickly denied for. So I called my oncologist and said, I want to pull the trigger on plan B. And he's a phenomenal partner, and so he called the principal investigator, or the person who's in charge of the trial, and they had a great peer-to-peer conversation around the design, the drugs that I would be on, any reservations that they might have. And I was in an outlet mall of all places when I got the phone call, and my oncologist said to me the words I needed to hear, which was, I think this is the right next step, which took me to Chicago for my first clinical trial. Now, I want to say that a strong clinician partner is mission critical in this journey. Having somebody who can help, deconstruct some of the language and help us to understand what we're committing to. But as good as our doctors are, they're not the ones who maybe share our exact priorities, and they don't have to necessarily live with the consequences. Trials are a very personal decision, and we shouldn't expect our doctors to make those decisions for us, which is why understanding the clinical trial process is really important to effective treatment and care. That being said, again, strong clinician partner is so important as we're stepping from that path of the known into the great unknown. When we talk about clinical trials, so this slide is really geared towards a little bit of novel therapies in terms of drugs, but clinical trials don't actually apply just to medications. They also apply to technologies, diagnostic tools, combinations of existing therapies. So there are a lot of different things that can be tested in clinical trials. In fact, on Saturday, I did a search of clinicaltrials.gov, which is the largest repository of information on trials, and there were 65,000 trials when I did a keyword search of cancer without any qualifiers. It's a tremendous amount of trials, and those play in the spaces of things like prevention. So there's a lot happening to evaluate different things that are coming down the pipeline medically. But the piece that I'm going to focus on first is going to be like a novel therapy, a new drug. So typically those things are discovered through research and development. That's going to be at maybe government institutions, research institutions. A lot of pharmaceutical companies have their own research and development departments. And then also every once in a blue moon you'll have an incidental finding, which is an oops. But sometimes the oopses can be pretty powerful. So once an agent is identified, then it'll be evaluated in vitro. So at the cellular level, we're looking to see how it interacts with cancer cells. And then if that kind of bears out, then we move into animal models. And around this time, the people who are running this research do kind of two different things. First, they start to develop a protocol. So they are going to test this idea of how to administer the drug first in animals with the intention maybe of moving to humans down the road. They're also potentially going to patent the compound. And I think that that's important for us to understand. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but this process is many years, 10 years sometimes, 12 years, 14 years for a drug to come to market from discovery. But the patent only lasts typically about 20 years. So there's a very limited amount of time at the end of a drug's life cycle once it's approved and is still on patent for them to recoup the cost. So we'll talk about some numbers in a little bit, but it's extremely, extremely expensive to bring a drug to market, to get it through the development and then beyond that through clinical trials. So at this point, if we like the idea and it's actually starting proof of concept in cells and in animals, we might petition the FDA for access to a live human patient population. That's where a phase 1 trial will come in. Phase 1 trials are very small, 10, 20, 30, 40 people. It's the first time that the drug's being evaluated in a human population, which means that they're trying to determine things like safety and what the appropriate dose might be. Another thing to note about phase 1 clinical trials is they're often one location, and that's in part a cost control because there's so much that has to go into determining that safety profile, but beyond that, it's also a data control because they have so much evaluation that goes into phase 1. It's easier to control the variables with one location and one dedicated group of people. So if the, if the concept proves true or it's safe and tolerable in that first population, about 70% of drugs at this point will advance into phase 2. Phase 2 might be a few other locations. This is where you're going to start to see potentially some randomization. So you're going to see multiple different ways that the drug is being administered into different types of populations. And depending on what they're looking at specifically, they might choose for you where you land. So you might not have a say in which arm of a trial you'll end up in. They also might blind what you're receiving, which is an interesting concept where you might not know actually what drug you're receiving. And sometimes in double-blinded scenarios, the people who are administering the treatment to you will not know what you're receiving. This is also an area where occasionally placebo will come into effect. We're going to talk about placebo on the next slide. But placebo is another way to control the validity of the data because phase 2, the goal in phase 2 is to determine the efficacy. So if the drug, we know it's safe or relatively safe from the first phase 1, but now moving into phase 2, is it actually doing what we think that it's doing? About 33% of trials advanced from phase 2 into phase 3. Phase 3 is the largest population. They can go on for years. And they're located at the largest number of sites. there is a higher likelihood at this point of masking and blinding, and it's also a comparison against standard of care. This is where that comparison sometimes is drawn. And only about 25 to 30% of phase 3 trials are approved. So if we do fancy math, that means that about 7% of novel agents that enter the clinical trial process will advance through to FDA approval. And that also is a very laborious process. It takes a tremendous amount of time, uses up a lot of resources, and there are a finite number of slots in each of these trials for patients to accrue to participate. So before we advance, we're going to talk about some misconceptions that patients often have around clinical trials. So the first one is near and dear to my own heart. It is considering phase 1. So I am a patient who is participating now in my second phase 1 clinical trial. I think that there's a little bit of a perception that phase 1 is like a 4-letter word, like placebo. We'll talk about that in a second. But phase 1 clinical trials are where some pretty exciting stuff is happening, and you're going to hear over the next couple of days how quickly the science is moving in our disease, which means that new opportunities are coming into phase 1 every day, in some cases that have never been done before. And there are some valid reasons to potentially be concerned about phase 1. You know, the side effects aren't always known. There can be unexpected side effects. There's also a burden on the patient in terms of travel that's a little bit more significant in the phase 1 setting. But what I would say here is I would encourage you to give phase 1 trials the same thoughtful consideration that you give any other treatment, because you might find something novel. Stacy mentioned this earlier, but my new trial right now is for CDKN2AB loss. Well, when I was diagnosed 3 years ago, there was nothing for that. And I didn't know until maybe 3 weeks ago that there is a target for that. So I'm delighted to have access to a targeted therapy that didn't exist before. And the fact that it's in phase 1, you know, I weighed that, but for me, it was the right decision. Placebo is another, I think, if you were to say clinical trial to anybody off of the street, this may be the word that comes up the most. I have nothing to back that up, but I would guess if you said clinical trial, most people would think that placebo, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get placebo, I'm gonna get the sugar pill. So placebo is a really curious thing where, for those who aren't familiar, what it means is that you are experiencing an effect that is not actually caused by what you're taking in. So that's why the sugar pill comes in, because there's no medicine in the sugar pill, but your brain believes that it's going to work, and for some short duration of time, it might, to a small degree. And so the mind is so very powerful that we have to control for that in scientific evaluation to make sure that the drug is having its intended effect. And that's, again, efficacy is phase 2. So I said one takeaway is when you go home from this conference and people ask you what you learned, you can tell them that you discovered you're a little bit psychic. But placebo in oncology is used very, very rarely. And in the instances it is, typically, it's used as a comparator against with another therapy. So an example would be all patients on the trial are getting a certain type of therapy, and then there's an additional agent that patients might receive that there's a belief might be effective. And so population 1 will get the therapy plus this new agent. Population 2 will get the therapy plus placebo. And you won't necessarily know that that's happening because the magic of placebo is you can't know that you're getting it. So in that scenario, everybody is getting some form of treatment. It's just an arm that's getting a little bit different treatment than the other. I've heard of one clinical trial where there was a true placebo. And if you encounter that, a couple of questions to ask would be, 1, at what point will I be evaluated to see if my disease has progressed? Is that 6 weeks? Is that 8 weeks? Is that via a scan? And at that time, will it be unblinded? So will I be told if I have progression what I was on? And if I was on placebo, will I be given access to the experimental agent? So those are a couple important things to remember about placebo, but again, very rarely used or fairly rarely used in oncology clinical trials. Paying for trials, we'll talk about that in a few slides, but this is, again, a significant barrier to patients. I'm going to talk about it really quick from an insurance perspective. So you have what's called standard of care, which are the things that would be done no matter where you are to manage your disease that insurance recognizes as important. And then you have the other medical expenses relating to the clinical trial, because there's so much more oversight and things that they might do. So typically, insurance will pay for the standard of care expenses, and the sponsor will pay for the trial-related expenses, medical expenses. Now, standard of care, the same rules still apply around insurance if they're in-network, out-of-network. So your deductible, your out-of-pocket maximums might change. But that's kind of typically how that's taken care of. The next one, I kind of call the guinea pig factor, right? So patients going into clinical trials have a perception that to the folks running the trials, I'm just a number, I'm just a vehicle for them to receive data. And I cease being a human being the way I am where I'm treated every day. So sometimes you might actually be in a clinical trial in your primary institution. There's not a transition of care, which is great. But speaking from experience at least, when you participate in clinical trials, you're interacting with nurses, trial coordinators, doctors at hospitals and research institutions who are treating patients every day and are going to treat you with the same kindness and care that they treat the other patients in their population. In fact, it could be argued that you'll spend more time with your medical team if you participate in clinical trials, because they will you'll be seeing them, in my case now, weekly. My trial coordinator called me on Monday to ask how my weekend was. I don't get that every day from my oncologist back home. But I would say there's a lot of incentive to maintain relationships with your primary team if you're going elsewhere for a clinical trial. The odd update. I think that it's a courtesy because they do become invested in our care, and if we leave their care to participate in some other type of therapy, we can pass feedback back. I think they want to know how we do. But beyond that, maybe this trial ends and we need to return to our team. Keeping them up to date on our medical care is important, and to assume that that communication is going to continue to happen between your trial team and your doctor would be, I think, an erroneous assumption. Finally, a lot of patients look at clinical trials as a last resort. This is the thing I'm going to try when all else has failed. I have nothing else left. This is my last-ditch effort. We talked a little bit earlier about all the different technologies and things that come into clinical trials. It can be preventative. Sometimes trials will require you to be chemo-naive. So if you've had chemo, you won't be eligible to participate in the trial. Sometimes the trials are for unique technologies. In my case, I could have attempted another chemo. Well, I know that chemotherapy is very cytotoxic to my blood counts. And I was concerned that prolonged exposure to chemotherapy, if I were to try another agent, would make me sicker and prove a barrier to trial participation down the road if my counts didn't rebound. So for me, it made a lot of sense where I was to try a trial. But also, trials can sometimes give us, progression-free survival for significant amounts of time with lower side effects in some cases than standard of care. So, the lesson here is really early and often. If you're interested in clinical trials, I highly recommend you start to look now or soonish, maybe like Sunday when you're home. Okay, so now we're going to transition to how do you find a clinical trial. This is a little bit of a tricky one because there is not one great, perfect repository for all things clinical trials. So before we get started with the specific locations, there's a little information packet. It should be on most tables. If you didn't get one, feel free to let me know. But to the left is some basic information. So you're going to want to know certain things about yourself and your care before you start looking at clinical trials. A one sheet like this is also helpful if you're going to have somebody in your life help you search for clinical trials. You can fill this out, make a copy, and they have a lot of information relating to your care. So we've got things, I can't see that there. We've got things like, so cancer type, we're obviously cholangiocarcinoma. You can specify intrahepatic, extrahepatic, parahilar, so that will matter in some trials. Your staging, if it's local or if it's metastasized. If it has metastasized, where is it now? What prior treatments you have had, list them all. Very important, because sometimes there will be restrictions around trying certain targeted therapies or certain therapies with the same target more than once. You're going to capture the results of your molecular profile, those are searchable terms. You're also going to capture any medications that you're on and what you'll see in the trial lingo as comorbidities. So those are going to be other health conditions that you have that you're going to use to determine whether or not you're eligible for a clinical trial. So now that we have our sheet filled out, you can go to like your local cancer center, cancer.gov, which is going to be the NCI tool. Those are a couple of different places that you can go to search for clinical trials. The gold standard is probably clinicaltrials.gov if you're in the United States. They do list some stuff internationally as well, so it's very much a resource for all comers. But the challenge with ct.gov is they're not required, or sponsors are not required to list phase 1. So they have to list 2 and 3 if they're interventional, but phase 1 they don't have to list. A lot of sponsors choose to put it out there because it helps in accrual, but phase 1 trials can be a little trickier to find, which is where you probably want to start at your local institutions first, and then maybe fan out from there, or go to the major cancer centers that you're aware of. There are also what are called clinical trial finder services. I've listed 2 of them. There are many more. So Emerging Med and Massive Bio. These are for-profit companies that provide a free service of clinical trial finding for patients. So you often have to provide them with maybe your molecular profile. There's sometimes a questionnaire. In some cases, they will request your records and you can have them sent. And they will have these navigators run both some algorithms on ct.gov and also mine some data from pharmaceutical partners and return a list of trials that they believe might be a good fit for you. The one thing to note is, again, they are for profit, which means that they have funding from somewhere. Sometimes it would be they're paid when they accrue into a patient into a clinical trial. It might be that certain pharmaceutical companies are just paying a certain dollar amount to be able to list their trials with those companies. So I would say, it's a really interesting and potentially helpful resource. I'm not going to talk about them anymore. I've worked with a couple and found them, valuable in some ways. So if you want more information about this experience or want to talk to me about it, you can come talk to me after or send me an email. So now we're going to do a quick search on ct.gov, and I'm shortening it. It's clinicaltrials.gov. I just don't like saying it that many times, so we're going to call it ct.gov. So in the example on the left, I'm just doing a keyword search of cholangiocarcinoma. I'm going to get somewhere over 100 results, between 100 and 150 results, depending on when you look. Some of those results are going to be trials that the only qualifier is you have cholangiocarcinoma, rarely. But you're also going to find some trials that, because cholangiocarcinoma is in the keyword search, they're targeted to very specific things. So it's not safe to assume that anything that comes up in those search results might apply to your situation. On the right side, because ct.gov is like pretty much any other searchable database, they've got advanced search, filtering, sorting. So on the right side, you see kind of an advanced search. So in this case, I'm actually going to omit the condition, the disease condition, because I want to see anything that's going to target a specific genomic event, FGFR2. And this also means that if there are basket trials, which are trials that are just maybe to solid tumor and they don't require a specific disease, I might find those and be eligible for those. So in the search I did FGFR2, I looked for recruiting, or I'm not yet recruiting and recruiting. There are other statuses that will show up on the site, things like closed. Those can provide value, and we'll talk about that in a few more slides, but typically if you want to narrow some of the data, then you'll do recruiting, not yet recruiting. And then you can also filter by a location. So I put in Utah and 300 miles from Utah because I thought that'd be fun. And some additional criteria that might be of interest to you would be things like the phasing and the funder type. And we'll talk about why funder type is particularly interesting in a couple of slides. I'm behind in my papers. Okay, so this would be some sample search results. And this is exactly what I got back when I did that search. So I didn't prioritize anything or massage this in any way. I just did that search and put this up. And these are actually 2 really interesting examples because at that first page, you're going to glean some pretty good information that might help you to decide I'm not going to look at this one. So the very first one requires advanced metastatic disease, surgically unresectable, failed previous therapy. So there's a lot of information to tell you whether or not it might be a good fit for you just in the title. I like the second one, though, because it has in the interventions drug placebo. So we talked about that a few minutes ago. When I click on the hyperlink there, which I don't have the image for, and I scroll down to see what the arms are, it's exactly that scenario I described earlier, where each arm is receiving, I think it's standard of care, and then there's an arm that's receiving the investigative agent. So it's not, if participating in that trial wouldn't mean that you would receive no medication whatsoever, or risk receiving no medication whatsoever. But that's not all. So once you've seen from the mere title a trial that you're maybe interested in, you'll go to the trial record page. And this is where it gets very, very jargon intensive and can be very intimidating. What you want to focus on are things like the inclusion and exclusion criteria, or the eligibility criteria, what I have listed here. So what's up on the screen are examples taken directly from clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3. I just grabbed a variety, not from any one trial. So these are samples of the types of things you might see in inclusion and exclusion criteria. Some of the more common things, so let me back up and talk about eligibility criteria. So by definition, that means in inclusion criteria, you have to have these things happening in your case to be eligible for the trial. Exclusion criteria, if you have this list of things happening or anything in this list of things happening in your care, then you would not be eligible for this clinical trial. So some common inclusion criteria would be a specific disease type, so maybe it's targeting cholangiocarcinoma. You might have to have a fresh biopsy to participate, which would mean, probably a core biopsy, which would mean you have to have tissue that they can access. You're going to see terms like ECOG status, Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group maybe, but in any event, it is a less tangible measure than, for example, a blood test, but it tells the people, the clinicians and the statisticians something about your state of health. So how you're executing day-to-day activities, if you need help for certain types of activities. They're trying to measure your wellness and how you're living with your disease. Resist criteria. This is another one that's pretty interesting. So to determine if something is working, we have to be able to see something that can change. So you have to have measurable disease of a certain size to be eligible for a lot of clinical trials, so that down the road when they perform the scans, they can see if there's shrinkage or if there's growth. So that's what that one is when you come across it. I've seen patients kind of get burned in that area because maybe it's, it's really in their bile ducts and it's very, very small and it's wreaking all kinds of havoc, but it wouldn't be enough to meet the standard of resist criteria on a scan, and that would make them ineligible for a trial. In terms of exclusion criteria, there are some things you might see like uncontrolled central nervous system involvement. You might see comorbidities, which means other illnesses such as another cancer. And also another one important to note would be prior treatments on a similar agent. So in my FGFR2 example, I might have exhausted one FGFR2 target. I want to move on to another. I found a trial for it, but it says in the exclusion criteria that I cannot have had an FGFR2 inhibitor in the past. But all of that being said, for the most part, I know there are a couple of caregivers and patients in the room who are actually doctors, but for the most part, we're not doctors and we're not even medical professionals. So I would caution to not make assumptions based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria, unless you are without a shadow of a doubt certain that it's something that applies to your care. Leave that to the trial team and the investigator to decide. Things like blood counts. So there might be a minimum requirement of 100,000 platelets, and you're on chemo right now, and your platelets are 75,000. And you think, well, that's it, I don't qualify, and you move on by. Well, that requirement might be at time of screening. So you might be washed out of chemo for a couple of weeks by the time you get to that screening appointment, and at that time your counts have rebounded, and now you're over 100,000 and you're eligible. So again, I wouldn't make any assumptions about inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria unless it's painfully obvious. Leave that to the medical professionals to decide. Once you've decided on a couple of trials that you feel really strongly about, now is the time maybe to approach your doctor. I have showed up to doctor's appointments with spreadsheets of 18 trials, and my poor doctor, who's a really good sport, has looked at the list and said, no, we need to triage this a little bit. So, when you're having those very serious conversations, we're going to talk about a very limited list, and we're going to take all factors into consideration: distance, what it's looking to target, our prior treatments, all of those things. In the event you don't have a strong physician partner, you are able to reach out by yourself. If you're looking at ct.gov records at the very bottom, you're going to see contact information for all sites. So you can reach out and explain your situation and say, I'd like to come and be screened for your trial. Most of the time they'll ask for your records, and then if everything checks out, then they would bring you out for that screening. But it's really in your best interest to have your doctor establish that contact on your behalf for a variety of reasons. They might see things in the jargon or understand things that we don't. They might have a conversation where they learn a little bit more about maybe unpublished data, and they decide this isn't what I want you to do. Another great reason to keep your physician involved is doctors are, or at least their offices, are a lot more better equipped to transfer records and images, and if that's all in the patient, that becomes extremely, extremely cumbersome. So once you have, there's been contact, the records have been transferred, so this is the point where they do that determination. Not necessarily are you in the trial, but would we like to see you to determine if you're a good fit? And so they are going to call you at this point to schedule a whole bunch of appointments. It is really in your best interest to make it very clear, if you're traveling, that you want things to be clustered together as much as possible. They can work magic. I know scheduling is a nightmare in healthcare, but they can do a lot of really magical things to cluster appointments, so you can have maybe one or two trips instead of 4, 5, and 6 for your eye appointment and your blood work and your scans and your biopsy and so forth. And when you get there for those screening tests, you may have had a biopsy in the past. Sometimes they need their own samples to go to the research labs. You may have had your scans done 3 weeks ago, but they need their own technology and their own images to establish the baseline for the trial. So there is a lot of testing that patients are subject to when being screened for a clinical trial. In that first appointment, though, you're also going to meet with the medical professionals involved with the trial, oftentimes a trial nurse, trial coordinator, sometimes physician's assistants, nurse practitioner, and the doctor who's overseeing the trial. In my experience, the doctors are fantastic and lovely and very knowledgeable, but the nurses know what's really going on. So make friends with your nurses. They will be an unbelievable resource for you through the process. They're also holders of a lot of knowledge that are not necessarily on this document that we're going to see in a minute called informed consent. So in that first appointment, you're going to meet all of these people and have a chance to review the documentation and ask your questions. So what is informed consent? So I was at my new hospital a few weeks ago, and I was being screened for one clinical trial, but the doctor I was seeing liked another clinical trial for me, and so they brought informed consent for both. And there was also an ask of me, if they were going to do a biopsy, if I'd be willing to donate some of my tissue and blood for research, which I always say yes to. So there's this form for that. So the image on the right, you can see a quarter as my frame of reference. I was in the doctor's office. I didn't have much to work with. But I put the quarter there so you could see the thickness of the quarter. And the stack to the right is the paperwork I had to read and digest while I was sitting there in the doctor's office. It was over 70 pages. It was a lot of information. Some of it is redundant. Some of the packed paper used familiar verbiage across the different protocols. But the FDA actually requires for certain things to be in this document called informed consent. So when you're at the point of decision around a trial, and you can actually request an informed consent before that appointment and save yourself a little bit of time. But they're going to put this document in front of you, and this is going to be kind of your Bible about a lot of things about the trial. So it's going to tell you things like purpose and duration of participation. Maybe participation on paper is only 30 weeks. It's going to tell you risks. This is where they're going to capture side effects, Possible side effects. It's the same as with chemo. Does everybody remember their first chemo appointment? Where they gave you maybe like a chemo teaching packet or something, and there were like 4 pages of possible side effects, and they were, I mean, just very alarming. And then you had your first appointment, and maybe you experienced a couple of them, but you certainly did not experience the whole catalog. The same applies to clinical trials. So you're going to potentially experience some of the side effects. Sometimes they list them in terms of incidence, so what the most common ones are, all the way down to the very rare. But they're obligated, if at any point a side effect presents, they have to include that in that document. This is, again, the clinical trial nurses. They have a little more insight into what they're actually seeing in clinic. The benefits. So sometimes the benefit of the trial is going to be worded in a way that says, our goal is to advance the science and we hope it helps you. Perhaps at the very high level of the sponsorship, that's true. They're there to compile data and determine if something's effective. But the benefit to participating in trials for us as patients is always some form of effective treatment. Potential time with disease progression-free survival, lower side effects. There are trials out there that in rare and exciting instances have cured people, called exceptional responses. So, you know, they can't promise a benefit. And you'll see when we start to see posters and presentations of data, sometimes the results are mixed. But our hope going in is that we're going to have some benefit, and they'll share with you what the benefit, hopefully, of the past has been. Alternatives are where they tell you what they think your alternatives might be, which is typically going to be standard of care or whatever the alternative to standard of care is. So if there's a certain line of chemo that is considered standard of care where you're being seen, they might recommend a second line of chemo. If you're seen at a clinic that is not GI, which can happen with some of the basket trials, some of the immunotherapies, then the alternatives might be very, very broad and not specific at all. If you're seen by a GI group, then they might actually have a little bit more in there, maybe not in the document, but in the consultation at least, to give you an idea of some alternatives. But I would never rely on that alternative as, oh, I do this or I do that. Your conversations with your doctor help determine your actual alternatives. Next up is voluntariness and right to withdraw without penalty. It's a mouthful. What this says is that this document is designed to protect you, not the sponsor. So if your life circumstances change 3 months into participating in a trial and you decide I can no longer participate, there is no penalty to you to do so. Now, your trial team will probably want to have a conversation with you about that for a variety of reasons, especially if the treatment's effective. They want you to be well. But there is no point in this process where you are obligated to participate. From the moment you sign that consent, you're going through the screening process, you show up day one for the appointment, you can walk right out the door. You don't have to participate in the trial. Confidentiality of records, I know this is important to some folks. Your records at the hospital will have identifying information to you, but a lot of times once the data feeds back to the sponsor, they remove that identifying information. So when results are published, they won't know that Cait Telaak, participated in that trial or that research. Compensation of injuries refers to if you have a side effect or an issue on the trial that has to be managed medically beyond the trial, who assumes the expense of that? And there's some language, that's some legalese that goes kind of above my head. And then person to contact for answers and questions. This is going to be typically the principal investigator, any other doctors relating to the trial, and your nursing team and trial coordinators. So there's probably going to be quite a few people listed in who to contact. But again, not everything is contained in that document, and so I have just a couple of questions that I might recommend asking if you're in that first appointment. So the first would be, what are the most common side effects you're actually seeing on this clinical trial? They might have some insight for you around, honestly, the number one is fatigue. Or in my prior trial to the one I'm on, it was ocular swelling. It was swelling around the eyes. And I don't know that I recall seeing that maybe very deep in the protocol, but the nurse said, this is most likely going to happen, and don't be alarmed. It was very helpful for me to hear as a patient. You can inquire if there are other cholangiocarcinoma patients on a trial. If it's a basket trial and it's not specific to our disease, you can ask the question. They might not answer it, but you can ask. You can also inquire if there's another patient on the trial who's willing to talk to you. In situations where there's placebo or there's blinding, that will typically be a no, because once you talk with another patient, you might be able to determine, oh, I think we're on different things. But there might be an instance where they say, yeah, I've had a patient who's offered themselves up as a contact if ever anyone wants to talk to them. And that can be, just as meaningful as these connections that we make here. It's meaningful to talk to somebody else who's been on this new experimental type of therapy. You can ask about unpublished results. Again, this is another one they can choose not to share. But if there have been some data that has been promising, you can ask to see that, and they might be able to give you some insight into how effective it's being and in what populations. Really important question would be, if I'm stable or I'm still seeing a response, positive response, beyond the trial's defined time, so maybe 30 weeks, what happens to me then? Can I still get access to that drug if I've timed out of your trial? And another really interesting and important one would be, do you offer compensation or expense reimbursement for participating? We're going to talk about, this is my segue into talking about finance. But that does happen sometimes, and it's not maybe something that they will volunteer, so it should always, bar none, be on your list of questions to ask. Now, so we talked about paying for trials from the perspective of the medical costs, but the costs beyond just the medical are astronomical. So you've got your gas, wear and tear on your car, you've got your tolls, you've got your meals, you've got your hotel stays, and that's just for you. You also are probably traveling with a caregiver, and so there's all of this expense related to their travel as well. I would say from patient conversations that I've had, two of the largest barriers to trial participation are cost and travel. There are some resources. Unfortunately, patients have to do their own legwork to get to them. There are some resources to help with paying for clinical trials beyond if you are compensated by the sponsor in some way. So first up, federally funded clinical trials. This applies to the United States. It might apply as well to some other countries, but I'm not sure on that one. But federally funded clinical trials in the United States, sometimes the expenses are covered for the patient. I know this is especially true out of research being done at Bethesda. So that's where, when we were looking at how to search earlier, you can click on how a trial is funded, and you can actually select federally funded and look specifically at those trials. It's not a guarantee that they'll cover all expenses, and they might have some limitations around how and what they cover, but there also are instances where patients have had every single expense paid for. It happens. Participation compensation. So this typically comes up more often in phase 1 as they're attempting to accrue, but there could be a per diem or per visit compensation to a certain dollar amount. You always want to ask if your caregiver is included in that, and you submit your receipts like you would in any other expense report. Independent resources. So, American Cancer Society is the one I think everybody thinks of, their Hope Lodge. But there are services for a wide variety of people and demographics. So if you start to search about specifics to your life and your situation, you might find things like, in my case, my husband is a veteran. And we found a resource that, for my first week of my trial, paid for our hotel, parking, and we got breakfast every morning. It was $600 that we spent out of pocket for our screening appointments, between gas and Airbnb and all of those different things. And we accepted that cost, even though it's a lot of money. I couldn't pay $600 a week to participate in a trial. There's no way that would work. So finding those types of resources is just incredibly meaningful. And sometimes, next up on social work support, your trial location will have local resources that you otherwise wouldn't find through searching online. So you can ask to be assigned to social work. You probably should always be asked to be assigned to a social worker, and they will give you maybe a list of hotels with negotiated rates with the hospital. They also might have their own house where they will put people up with certain guidelines. Maybe you have to be inpatient, or maybe it's a certain number of days, or maybe there's a certain amount of wait. But that's another place to seek resources. And then when all else fails, I don't understand a whole lot about taxes. you can save your receipts and you can submit medical expenses. It has to exceed a certain percentage of your income, and it does cover things like travel and meals. There's a list online of all the different types of expenses that fall under that category. I think it changes kind of often, so just make sure I would talk to whoever your tax professional is and figure out how to do that, but those expenses are tax deductible. There are other paths to treatment outside of clinical trials. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but there are government-sponsored programs called Expanded Access or Compassionate Use and Right to Try, which is new legislation that came out last year. Both of these are paths for patients to request access for treatments that are in phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. The first one, Expanded Access, you actually apply through the FDA. I've heard that it's actually a pretty quick process. And about 99% of applications are accepted. And then the FDA is a part of that conversation going forward. Right to Try allows you to go directly to the pharmaceutical, and by you, I mean your doctor. Go directly to the pharmaceutical company and ask for access to the drug. Now, there is not a provision in either of these that says how the treatment, if approved, will be paid for. So you might have to pay out of pocket at list rates, something to consider and ask about. There's also no guarantee that you will gain access. So the sponsors are required to have a contact for you to be able to reach out to, but the obligation ends there. So they might have a very limited amount of the drug available and it's very expensive to produce. They might look at your case and decide that it's a significant safety concern. There are a variety of reasons why that access might be denied. But there's also off-label use. So let's say there's a drug in a clinical trial that's been approved for another indication. So it's available for your oncologist to prescribe. It's just not intended for the use that they're prescribing it for. And again, maybe it's in clinical trials and you just aren't eligible, or there's not enough spots in the trials, or it's too far. So your doctor might be able to look at this off-label process. Again, insurance might deny it. You might be hit with some pretty hefty bills. Another way to try and access off-label is, again, to go through the pharmaceutical company and say, here's where I'm at, this is my intention, this is what I'd like to do. All of these processes can take a significant amount of time. I've heard 1, maybe 2 months. I've also heard of patients that get through the whole process with very high hopes and they're not granted access to the medicine. So as advocates, this is an area that we'd like to see some improvement, but we also respect that there are some good reasons that there are protections around having access to these experimental agents. So I just have 2 or 3 more slides. So at the end of the day, participating in any treatment is a very personal decision. We need to decide for ourselves what are our goals, what are our values. So, how much time am I comfortable being away from home? Who can I count on to be a travel companion if I need somebody to come with me? What do I want to get out of participating on this trial? Am I going in with level expectations? I'm on a targeted therapy right now that's very experimental. I'm part of maybe 25 patients who've ever tried it. My hope is that I will get some quality of life and some good time on this drug. I think that's a realistic expectation. I don't have an expectation that when I have my first scan in 8 weeks or so, that it's all going to be gone. How will I pay for travel expenses? Looking at your family budget, determining costing out how much things will cost. Am I comfortable with the risks? Again, some of the risks are unknown. And finally, what are my possible alternatives? I remember when I first heard about my recurrence, I had an appointment with my oncologist, and we talked about chemo, and we talked about targeted therapies and trials and radiation and a whole crazy amount of options. And I said, I want to understand what my life looks like on every single one of these, including if I chose to do nothing. It's important to know what we value and what we're willing to do to be able to get access to experimental treatments. So some parting thoughts. If you've not had a molecular profile done yet, there's no time like the present. Even if you have archived tissue, it can still potentially be sent out. They're required to keep this tissue for maybe 10 years or more. So you would just call up your oncologist's office, say, I'm just calling to confirm that you have the archived tissue, and that you'll be sending it out on Monday at my request. Maybe not being that direct, but Also, if you're wanting to start staying on top of the information but are finding it hard to do the Google searches, let Google do it for you. You can have information pushed to you through Google Alerts, PubMed Alerts, where you can set up automated emails to come to you on specific topics. I have things like my genetic alterations set up for those alerts. If you're not on social media, it might be time to sign up. You can sign up as Daffy Duck. No one has to know it's you. But there are some patient-run groups, especially on Facebook. We also have our discussion boards with the foundation. You're going to find so much information there. I learn about new treatments every single day when I'm reading and how people are responding to things and novel responses and challenges that folks are having. There's even, Matt Reedy runs an immunotherapy and targeted therapy Facebook group. So it's really just a population of people who are looking for the novel, the exciting, the different. Look for trials early and often. It may save you time down the road. So if you have a trial in mind and you've already established contact, then maybe when chemo fails and you're going through this washout, so you have to have 21 to 28 days, depending on the trial design, where you've had no treatment before you can start the new treatment, you can have some of the legwork done so you're filling that time with those appointments. The screening appointment, the scans, all of those things. So maybe 4 weeks after you've finished chemo, you can launch into this new experimental therapy. So time is really important, and pre-work will save you time. Partner with your oncologist to build plans A, B, and C, and so forth. And if you have any questions or you want to talk about this further, I'm only here through midday tomorrow because I have to be in Boston on Friday for my trial. But I have my email address listed at the bottom. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. And, oh no. Oh, they're in there. I'm kidding. Okay, so I know we're kind of, again, surveying you to death today. I'm really sorry. But I have a survey. Some paper copies are going to come around, and there's survey links up there. This is a survey for providers and patients. There are 2 different surveys. So providers in the room, we're asking you to participate as well. And we only ask that you fill out one. So if you fill out the paper copy, please do not fill out the Survey Monkey and vice versa. So this is some information requested by our ICRN to help understand the difference in perceptions. Well, actually, I'm not going to tell you anything about it because I don't want to color your results. So just go ahead and look at the surveys. There's also going to be one more survey, which is for feedback for our PCORI grant, which should be at the tables. It's the half sheet. And we have a session directly after this for posters. You're going to be able to look at some posters and engage with some pharmaceutical companies about trials that they're running. And so that's going to be an evaluation of both this presentation and that poster session. So hang on to that, and we'll collect those after. So if right now you could work on the survey, and I'm going to ask my panel to come up and join me, and we'll take your questions around clinical trials. I don't. Oh, they might be in the war room by the printer. And if you do have questions and you're done with the survey and you want to head to the mics, we've got the 2 in back, and we do have the roving mic as well. Susan is holding that up over there. All right, and I'm going to introduce who I have here with me on stage. So I've got Dr. Renuka Iyer. She's a clinical oncologist at Roswell Park in Buffalo, New York. I've got Sarah Bobiak, Scientific Director of Immuno-Oncology at EMD Serono. I've got Jerry Huang from she's a VP of Clinical Development from Taiho Oncology. And I'm sure most of you know Melinda. She's our advocacy coordinator with the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. She's also an exceptional responder to a very novel clinical trial. So you've got patient, you've got industry, and you've also got a very gracious oncologist here to answer any questions that you have around clinical trials. All
I
right, Rick.
have a question from Facebook. Has there been any discussion to come to an agreement with the pharma companies that phase 3 clinical trials not contain double-blind or placebo sectors? Phase 1 and 2 of the trial should answer those questions. By phase 3, when dealing with this terminal cancer, placebo-based is sending some too far to recover, especially if the first line is mandatory, which is 3 months of a person's life, usually with a year or less.
I think this is a really, really good question, and I think that this is in pharmaceutical companies that we often struggle with. I think on one hand, how best you can assess the, evaluate the drug efficacy. I think as Cait mentioned that, you don't want to have some confounding factors in the analysis. I think that's why some of the times that we use this randomized study, double-blind, and sometimes involved placebo control. But I think that, as it has been discussed often in oncology, in particular in first line, there are standard care. So just the placebo control itself with a investigational drug is rarely used nowadays in first line when we know that there is effective treatment already exist.
I would just add, as an oncologist, we struggle.
Hello, testing.
Hello.
Okay, it's on, it's just very quiet. Can we get?
As an oncologist, when we're offering trials to our patients, we struggle too when there's a placebo arm. But to the person who's asking the question, there have been exceptions where drugs have been approved without having to go through the phase 3. An example is Merkel cell cancer, where avelumab is an anti-PD-L1 drug that showed great results in the second-line setting, and the first-line trial really didn't have any. They just went ahead and said, here you go, the approval is based on exceptional responses. So there are certain exceptions to getting a drug approved, but they're very, few. And trying to do it with 2:1 randomization, where the odds are 66% that the patients will get the actual agent, does allow us to feel somewhat, less bad about, offering that option. But sometimes without that, the rigor of that process is set. So we know that before we say, here, take this, and feel confident that, like as Cait said, you often ask us, what if I did nothing? What would happen? And that's how we can answer that question. If everyone was equally eligible and you chose not to do this, what might your life be like? And that's partly where that's coming from. I wish there was a better answer.
I think just one more thing I would add to that is that there's governing bodies that oversee the process of running trials to make sure that we don't do bad things. And a lot of times the regulators set the rules and say that this is required so that we can really be assured that what you're saying happens with this drug actually happens.
Hello, that's actually a helpful segue. My name is Jack Calloway. Just a quick question. There are a lot of great minds, a lot of great doctors, a lot of great researchers all trying to tackle this challenge that everyone is facing in this room right now. And we heard, I think, in the presentation earlier, which was really helpful, sometimes it takes 10, 12, 14 years to work your way through I think some of the regulations you referred to. I guess a question I have is for people who work in the field, is the FDA, is the government a bottleneck? And is there a work stream to turn 14 years into 3 or speed things up?
So I can start out. I think the avelumab example is a really good example where there was sort of an accelerated process, and I think that there are other examples of that. with some of the emerging therapies that are happening. I think the FDA is not trying to be a bottleneck. They're really trying to work with everyone to get these drugs make these drugs available to patients, and there are processes where there's sort of accelerated approval or breakthrough designation, and so they are really trying to accelerate how quickly we can get promising drugs to patients. But there's also the safety that they have to really watch, and so if they accelerate something, it gets into the patients, and then 3 years later they find out that, X, Y, or Z is happening as a result, then they're going to, have to take responsibility for that too. And so it's a really careful balance. I do think that they're trying their best to make these drugs available to patients in that partnership.
I would add, I meant to mention in the presentation, but I didn't, that there's such a thing as phase 4 clinical trials, which is actually post-FDA approval. Sometimes the FDA actually requires that, so there was something in the results that they said, okay, we're going to approve this with a caveat that we would like you to continue to study this aspect of the drug. So it's a way that they're working with the sponsor to be able to get the drug approved. And sometimes also sponsors choose to do that on their own because they don't understand some of the very long-term impact of some of these agents. And that speaks to that safety factor. So we can follow patients through the trial process potentially for years and know how this is impacting their lives, quality of life, and health many years down the road beyond just the 30 weeks, for example, that they were on treatment. Any other questions?
I was always a keener. Just to elaborate again, there was 2 companies that you talked about that can help navigate, and
they're
then
just
there
2
was
examples.
Perthera also part of that?
No, that's a different organization, and actually, that was a very limited list. If you were to Google Clinical Trial Navigator, Clinical Trial Finder, there are very many out there. Emerging Med, I think, spoke at the conference a few years ago, and that was my first introduction to this idea of a clinical trial navigator. Again, want to stress that they're funded some way, somehow, so you want to keep that in mind when you're getting those results.
And then, sorry, where does Perthera work? Was it just because they were
They were mentioned because they were a partner in that Bayer process. I don't know much about their company and their practices.
Yeah. So Perthera partnered with us, and like Stacey mentioned earlier, they're more like a patient concierge service. So they're going to initiate that contact to help you get the molecular profiling done. And once that profiling is done, then that gives a list of available clinical trials based on those mutations that come back from your profile.
Okay, and then just again, when someone's looking for a trial, because again, there's so much information and different molecular targets, is anybody at a stage where they might say, let's say somebody has 4 or 5 targets, which ones have more validity or targetable actions? Is there like a list to go down, is it IDH1 or is it the whatever the...
So if you have like a
P53.
if you have a couple that have targets, how do you prioritize those kind of?
Right.
It's $1 million question, and the hardest perhaps for anyone to answer. And I know Louis and, Jennifer, this is sort of like their life. They've done this all their lives. They're really trying to figure out what mutations are the present the most, driving the growth of the disease, the progression of the cancer. And so I guess the short answer is we don't know, but the simple way, at least how I approach it, if someone comes to me is, when you see a drug that is further along, because there's 3 things that are going to drive your decision. One is access to drug, and how proven is it? What is the track record? Just like how you pick your doctor, you pick your car, you want to know, is it at phase 3 stage? Well, this means that there is phase 1, phase 2 evidence. So if you have 2 mutations and one is at phase 3, you're a little bit more likely to, as a physician, recommend. I can speak for most of us here, as that is the first choice. And some of it has to do with your confidence in just your whole experience in the trial. I know what side effects you'll have, so on and so forth. The second factor that drives it is what proportion of patients have it? How active, is it? Like, how frequent is this mutation? And when we say frequent, there's 2 ways of interpreting frequent. How many cells within the tumor have it versus how many patients have it. So a mutation that you know is very frequent, like HER2, is amplified in gallbladder. You know this happens a lot. So you have a lot of experience treating people with that mutation. So you're a little more likely to go there even though there's no phase 3 trial. So it's the frequency, but a little bit more of our comfort. And then the third is, these are like the sort of shot in the dark bullets where you have the Turk or you have, like these new really amazing responses. You just saw an example with Matt with, immunotherapy responses that have been exceptional. And so sometimes you see something that hits you and you know that this drug, when it works, really works. So those are sort of in a line, 1, 2, 3. But more often than not, we find KRAS and 4 or 5 others that are all still, we're still working our way through. And some studies people are doing, I know in esophageal, Dan Catenacci at University of Chicago tries to do circulating DNA. There's some work going on in this field to say, can you find mutations in the circulation? And what mutation was there? Okay, it was EGFR when you started. And look, now later we're seeing something else. So maybe that EGFR population that we targeted is no longer in circulation. It's not perfect, but should we now change our therapy to, try some sort of trial that has chemo and a drug that targets that other mutation now? So that's a work in progress. But short answer, talk to your doctor. Maybe they can help you figure it out. I don't know if you have anything to add, Jennifer, or...
We have another question in the back.
Okay, are clinical trials easier to access in Europe or other countries? And are they faster or more effective than coming to the US?
I think that it's not just by country, it's even by institution and the time for each institution to review the protocols and get the institution approval, it's different. So I think that again, a more interaction with your investigator, your oncologist, I think it's important so that you ask the question, what is the expectation of kind of like this trial I am aware of, and about, what time that this trial is actually going to be activated at the institution that your oncologist is going to participate in.
I think too, in some ways in the States, we benefit by just a massive population. So if you've got over 300 million people, you're going to have more candidates, more opportunity to accrue, more incidence of disease, so there might be more activity in trials than in some other places with smaller populations. I don't know if that's true, that's just an assumption I might make.
I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think it depends. There's great variability across the world. I mean, in Asia, the way that some of the regulators and the process works can be longer than in the U.S., for example, but it might also be shorter. It just kind of depends on the rules that you have to follow for that country. But once you're in the trial, the time to complete the trial is no different. The protocol is the same globally. So however the trial is designed in the U.S., it's the same in Europe, it's the same in Asia, Australia, it doesn't matter. It's the same across the globe if it's a global trial.
Okay, any last questions?
Hi.
Oop, we'll take 2 more.
Searching the clinical trials, a lot of the exclusion criteria would be if someone has autoimmune disease, and I know a lot of cholangiocarcinoma patients have either ulcerative colitis or PSC, which would exclude them for those trials. So I just want to know from the oncologists if they were able to get through that barrier to either get them on a trial or get compassion use from the farm companies. Or once you have that exclusion, or you just forget about that drug and move on to the next one?
It's a tough question. I think, I'm not a physician, I'm a scientist, but I think that, part of the concern or part of the reason for that is because you don't want to have too many factors going on and then you're not really sure, or it may not be safe because we may be hyperstimulating your immune system, and then if you have ulcerative colitis, it could just make it worse. And so it's sort of a balance of trying to figure out what can the patient have and still have this drug safely. And so right now, with some of the new therapies that are coming out, we're sort of erring on the side of caution and making sure we sort of understand what that relationship is with the immune system, since we're trying to harvest the immune system to kill the cancer. So it's a tricky question, but I wouldn't say that just because you have an autoimmune disease that it's never going to be an option for you. I think that the more we learn about some of these immunotherapies that are coming to the market, and we understand, once they're in, especially in other indications where they're more prevalently used, and they're in the market, and there are people with lupus who have lung cancer who are getting a IO therapy, an immunotherapy, we can understand what that relationship is. And so I think it's just going to take time for everyone to feel comfortable with delivering some of these drugs in some of the patients that have some of these other things.
And occasionally we can find, to your point about the compassionate use, I have a patient right now and she has had a total colectomy, so I think that the concern that, we would flare her somehow is lower because there really isn't a colon in place at the moment. So we did end up treating her, but not on a trial. So that's just something also to be aware of.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to break. I think I see a hand over here to the left in the t-shirt. And if we didn't get to anybody's question, again, please, cait.telaak@cholangiocarcinoma.org. You can email me, and I can get it to someone smarter than me to get you an answer.
Yeah, I was going to talk to somebody at the exhibits out there, but I think this is a good group to ask this question to. So with us, we had the molecular profiling, and we had one mutation that was targetable, and we looked, and there really weren't any good clinical trials out there at that time for that. Fortunately, I believe our oncologist went directly to the pharmacy company and got it through the right to try, and we've had good results from it. But my question is my plan is to make sure that, if we get to the point to where we have progression again, my plan is to get new genomic testing of the cancer. I just was wondering what your experience was with a second test, and have you seen a lot of cases where second tests, say a year later with new tumors, are showing brand new mutations? Do you see that happening a lot, or is it rare that you find new mutations?
So personally, we haven't done it a lot. Some of it is insurance coverage, based. I have had instances where the time period between the testing is long. And I don't know whether it's a function of the number of mutations, because when you look at what Foundation tests for now in reports versus what they used to 3 years ago, I don't know how much of it, like the whole immune panel that they're offering now is all new. So it's not like it wasn't there. I wonder if it was there, but they weren't reporting it, So there's some element of that, but yes, the short answer is yes, there have been instances in my partners, in my group, where there's patients with colon cancer and they have a recurrent tumor, and we wonder, is it like a new tumor on the other side of the colon, or why is the profile a little bit different? Even simple things, KRAS mutation, and so that can happen, but the frequency is small. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I think that from the clinical trials context, some of the clinical trials now, as Jennifer alluded to, that use this circulated DNA to assess the emerging mutations upon progression, so that have a better understand of what pathway that being activated upon progression, so that the oncologist can basically look for whether or not there is now a new drug to target the new mutation that caused the resistance to the previous treatment.
Okay.
I guess one thing I would add to is, I think that also there can be a change in the value. So it may have been expressing less, and then with treatment or progression of the disease, it may change in value and become more highly expressed. And so I think there's some evolution, but it may not necessarily be a new mutation, but just a change in how the mutation is showing up.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you to my panel, who are fantastic, and we're able to answer all of your questions. But again, if you have more, please email me. Melinda's making a face.
I just want to remind everybody to head over to the room 250. There's a clinical trial poster session right now. So if you have any questions, there should be people over there to ask and go over it.
Oh, Jennifer, did you have something to say?
3:15?
Okay,
Be back
so-
in the room by 3:15? 3:20.
3:20. Okay, so go learn about clinical trials one-on-one with some great pharmaceutical partners, and we'll be back here at 3:20. Thank you.